blood-stained the imported Italian marble floors of the Continental Club. But it did not belong to a rival gangster or a treacherous informant. It belonged to a 7-year-old girl, clutching a torn, mud-soaked teddy bear. Rain had drenched her tiny, shivering frame as she stood there, staring up at the most ruthless crime lord in all of Chicago. Hardened criminals held their collective breath, hands hovering over concealed weapons, waiting for the boss to give the order. Remove her immediately, D. Instead, the untouchable Declan Gallagher slowly, deliberately, lowered his crystal whiskey glass. If you are watching this story, drop your country name right now in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Table No 6, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The beaten my sister. The child sobbed, her fragile voice echoing in the dead, silent room. What happened next would rewrite the city's dark underworld history forever. Cigar smoke hung thick and heavy in the VIP lounge of the Continental Club, wrapping around the dimly lit crystal chandeliers like a suffocating fog. Declan Gallagher, the undisputed kingpin of the Irish-Italian syndicate in Chicago, sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. His tailored charcoal bruni suit hugged his broad shoulders, exuding an aura of quiet, terrifying authority. Men across the city whispered his name with a mixture of reverence and absolute dread. Tonight, Declan was in the middle of a highly volatile negotiation with the Romano family regarding control over the lucrative shipping docks on Lake Michigan. Millions of dollars of illicit cargo were at stake, and the tension in the room was sharp enough to slice through bone. Sitting to Declan's right was his most trusted enforcer, Sullivan, a hulking brute of a man whose face bore the jagged scars of 100 street wars. Staple. The Romano brothers sweated profusely, their eyes darting nervously toward Declan's expressionless face. Declan was a man who calculated every variable, a predator who rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. He was just about to deliver an ultimatum that would likely end in a bloodbath when a sudden jarring commotion erupted near the heavy brass doors of the private lounge. Shouts echoed from the corridor, the sound of heavy footsteps, a muffled curse, and the distinct thud of a grown man hitting the carpeted floor made every mobster in the room reach instinctively for the holsters hidden beneath their tailored jackets. Sullivan stood up, pulling a heavy caliber pistol from his waistband, his eyes locked on the entrance. "Boss, stay back," Sullivan growled, moving to shield Declan. Declan merely raised a single calm hand, signaling his men to hold their fire. The heavy oak doors burst open, revealing not a squad of rival hitmen or heavily armed federal agents, but a tiny, desperate hurricane of a child. She slipped right through the frantic grasp of two massive security guards who looked absolutely bewildered, terrified of using force on a little girl in front of their boss. She was perhaps 7 years old, wearing a threadbare yellow raincoat that was entirely soaked through, dripping a mixture of freezing rain and dark alley mud onto the pristine floor. Her knees were scraped and bleeding, leaving faint crimson smudges on the white Italian marble. In her left hand she gripped the detached arm of a stuffed bear, her knuckles white with absolute terror. Her large, panicked blue eyes darted around the room, taking in the terrifying suited men with their weapons drawn, before locking on to the man sitting at the head of the table. Even at her young age, she possessed an instinctual understanding of power. She knew without a shadow of a doubt who was in charge. "Hey, get out of here, kid!" one of the Romano brothers yelled, his voice cracking with misplaced adrenaline. "Guards, throw this little rat back onto the street." Declan's cold, steel-grey eyes snapped towards the Romano brother, the temperature in the room instantly plummeting. "Speak again in my establishment, Carmine, and I will have Sullivan remove your tongue," Declan said, his voice a low, growly whisper that carried a lethal promise. Silence instantly reclaimed the room. Declan slowly pushed his chair back and stood to his full imposing height. He walked around the mahogany table, his polished leather shoes making slow, deliberate sounds against the marble. The armed guards backed away immediately, lowering their heads in submission. Declan crouched down until he was at eye level with the trembling child. Up close, he could see the angry purple bruise forming on her left cheekbone, a mark left by a grown man's hand. Something dark and violent shifted deep within Declan's chest. A primal fury he usually reserved for those who betrayed him. "What is your name, little one?" Declan asked, his tone surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the monster the underworld knew him to be. "Lily," she stammered, her tiny chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. "Lily Jenkins. And how did you get past my front door, Lily Jenkins?" he asked, wiping a streak of mud and blood from her tear-stained cheek with the pad of his thumb. "I bit the big man at the door," she confessed, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Please, mister, you look like the boss. You have to help her. They're hurting her so bad. They said they were going to kill her if she didn't pay the ghost money." Declan's eyes narrowed fractionally. Ghost money was a street term for phantom interest on illegal loans, the kind of predatory lending that bottom-feeding loan sharks used to trap desperate people in unending cycles of debt. "Who are they hurting?" Lily Declan asked softly, though the men behind him could see the muscles in his jaw ticking with suppressed rage. "My big sister, Clara." Lily sobbed, suddenly grabbing the lapels of Declan's thousand suit with her muddy, blood-stained hands. They dragged her out of our apartment. They took her into the dark alley behind the butcher shop on 4th Street. The man with the gold tooth. He hit me when I tried to stop them. He told me to run and never come back, but I heard her screaming, "Please, they're beating my sister." The sheer desperation in the little girl's voice cracked something open in the silent room. Even the hardened killers looked away, uncomfortable with the raw, agonizing reality of the child's plea. Declan Gallagher stared into Lily's eyes, seeing a ghost from his own traumatic past, reflecting back at him. He remembered the feeling of being utterly helpless, of watching someone he loved being torn apart while the world did nothing to intervene. Declan stood up smoothly, adjusting his jacket. He didn't bother looking back at the Romano brothers. "Hell, the meeting is over," he declared, his voice devoid of all warmth. But Declan, the shipping routes, Carmine Romano started to protest. "Sullivan," Declan interrupted, his eyes fixed dead ahead. "Get the cars. Bring the heavy artillery. We are going to 4th Street. Sullivan grinned, a terrifying, predatory stretching of his scarred lips. "With pleasure, boss." Declan looked down at the shivering girl and carefully draped his heavy, dry suit jacket over her tiny shoulders. "Stay here with my men, Lily. Eat whatever you want from the kitchen. I'm going to bring your sister back." As Declan strode out of the club, flanked by his deadliest enforcers, the storm outside seemed to match the dark, violent tempest brewing within the Mafia boss. Whoever was touching Clara Jenkins was about to learn a very painful lesson about the hierarchy of the Chicago underworld. Cold, unrelenting rain lashed against the crumbling brick walls of the narrow alleyway behind O'Malley's butcher shop. The air was thick with the metallic stench of discarded animal blood, overflowing dumpsters, and the unmistakable suffocating scent of pure terror. Clara Jenkins was huddled on the wet, filthy asphalt, gasping for breath as she clutched her ribs. Her long, dark auburn hair was plastered to her face, matted with the blood seeping from a deep gash above her eyebrow. Standing over her was Ricky Bowl, a mid-level loan shark with a reputation for sadistic cruelty. Ricky was a greasy, deeply unpleasant man who wore cheap suits and heavy gold chains to mask his profound insecurities. He was flanked by 3 massive knuckle-dragon thugs who laughed every time Clara groaned in pain. You see, Clara, Ricky sneered, kneeling down to grab a fistful of her wet hair and yanking her head back. Clara hissed in agony, her vision swimming. Your deadbeat father, God rest his useless soul, owed me 50 grand before his liver finally gave out. And in this beautiful city of ours, debts don't just disappear into the grave. They get passed down to the next of KQQ. I told you. Clara wheezed, tasting copper in her mouth. I don't have it. I work double shifts at the diner just to feed Lily. We have nothing, Ricky. You've taken our furniture. You took my mother's wedding ring. There is literally nothing left to bleed from us. Oh, I wouldn't say that. Ricky chuckled, a wet, vile sound. He ran a rough thumb over Clara's bruised jawline, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. You're a very pretty girl, Clara. A bit bruised right now, sure, but nothing a little makeup can fix. I know a few private clubs downtown that cater to wealthy men with tasif tastes. You work for me for a year or two on your back, and we'll call the debt settled. Go to hell, Clara spat, a mixture of saliva and blood landing squarely on the lapel of Ricky's cheap jacket. Ricky's face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. He backhanded her viciously, the heavy gold rings on his fingers slicing open her cheek. Clara collapsed against the wet pavement, a ringing sound filling her ears. Darkness threatened to pull her under, but she fought it with every ounce of her willpower. Her only comforting thought was that Lily had gotten away. She had screamed at her little sister to run, to keep running until her legs gave out. If Lily was safe, Clara could endure whatever torture these monsters inflicted upon her. Teach her some manners, boys. Ricky barked, standing up and wiping his jacket with a silk handkerchief. Break a few fingers, but see how well she serves coffee at the diner with shattered hands. One of the larger thugs, a bald giant wielding a heavy lead pipe, stepped forward, a cruel smile stretching across his face. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, curling into a tight ball, waiting for the agonizing crunch of bone. She prayed silently, begging whatever higher power was listening to protect her sister, but the blow never came. Instead, the deafening roar of a high-powered engine shattered the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Headlights, blindingly bright and impossibly intense, flooded the narrow alleyway, casting long, menacing shadows against the brick walls. Two sleek, pitch-black Cadillac Escalades blocked the only exit to the street, their tires screeching against the wet pavement. Ricky shielded his eyes, cursing loudly. Hey, who the hell do you think you are? This is private business. Back the cars up before I have my boys put bullets in your windshields. The doors of the Escalades opened simultaneously. The synchronized sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement echoed like a military procession. 6 men stepped out into the pouring rain, spreading out in a calculated tactical formation. They didn't wear cheap leather or tracksuits. They wore tailored dark suits, and the weapons they carried weren't cheap street guns, but customized military-grade hardware. At the center of the formation, stepping out of the formation, summoned from the underworld, was Declan Gallagher. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked down the alleyway with a slow, predatory grace, his cold, gray eyes locked entirely on Ricky Ball. Sullivan walked half a step behind him, a suppressed submachine gun resting casually against his hip. Ricky's jaw dropped, all the color instantly draining from his greasy face. In the criminal ecosystem of Chicago, Ricky was a bottom-feeding scavenger. Declan Gallagher was an apex predator. The sheer absurdity of the most powerful mafia boss in the city appearing in this filthy alleyway completely short-circuited Ricky's brain. Mr. Gallagher, Ricky stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He quickly shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to look non-threatening. I didn't know you were in this neighborhood, sir. If this is about territory, I pay my percentages on time. I swear to God, Declan stopped 3 feet away from Ricky. He didn't look at the lone shark. Instead, his gaze shifted downward, landing on the broken, bleeding form of Clara Jenkins, lying on the wet asphalt. Clara stared up at the man, her vision blurry. She didn't know who this imposing stranger was, but the sheer aura of terrifying power radiating from him made her breath catch in her throat. "Is this the sister?" Declan asked, his voice deathly quiet. "Yes, boss," Sullivan replied, glancing at Clara. "Fits the description the K it gave us." Ricky looked frantically between Declan and the girl on the ground. "Mr. Gallagher, sir, this is just a minor collection issue. Her old man owed me a lot of money. I'm just balancing the books. Standard street business. You know how it is." Slowly, deliberately, Declan turned his gaze back to Ricky. The look in Declan's eyes was so completely devoid of human empathy that Ricky physically took a step backward, his boots splashing in a muddy puddle. "You hit a child tonight, Richard," Declan stated, the fact hanging in the cold air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. "A little girl in a yellow raincoat." Ricky swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the freezing rain. She was biting us, sir. She was interfering with collection. I just gave her a little push, that's all. It was an accident." And then Declan continued, taking one slow, menacing step closer. "You dragged this woman into an alley, beat her, and threatened to sell her into human trafficking." "It's just business, Mr. Seller into human trafficking." "Gallagher," Ricky pleaded, his voice reaching a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "Her father owed me. And now," Declan whispered softly, moving with a sudden, blinding speed that defied his large frame, "you owe me." Before Ricky could even blink, Declan's hand shot out, his massive fingers wrapping around Ricky's throat like a vice of solid steel. With a terrifying display of raw physical strength, Declan lifted the struggling lone shark completely off the ground. Ricky's legs kicked wildly in the air, his hands clawing desperately at Declan's unyielding grip, his face rapidly turning a deep shade of purple. The 3 thugs, seeing their boss suffocating, instinctively reached for their weapons. "I wouldn't," Sullivan warned cheerfully, raising the muzzle of his submachine gun. The other 5 enforcers clicked the safeties of their weapons in perfect unison. The terrifying metallic clacking sound echoed loudly off the alley walls. The thugs froze, their hands hovering over their holsters, correctly deducing that dying in a filthy alley for minimum wage wasn't worth loyalty to a dead man. Silence, absolute and suffocating, descended upon the alley, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the horrifying sound of Ricky Bowl choking. Declan held the man suspended in the air for what felt like an eternity, watching with cold, detached fascination as the life fought a losing battle inside the lone shark's panicking eyes. Clara watched from the ground, paralyzed by shock and awe. The man saving her wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a beautifully tailored demon, a creature of violence who operated on a terrifyingly different frequency than the thugs who had tormented her. Just as Ricky's eyes began to roll back into his skull, Declan casually tossed him aside. Ricky hit a stack of wooden pallets with a sickening crunch, collapsing onto the wet garbage, gasping frantically for air, clutching his bruised throat. He retched violently, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant tormentor he had been just minutes prior. Declan pulled a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and meticulously wiped the rainwater and dirt from his hands. "Sullivan," he commanded, not taking his eyes off the shivering thugs. "Boss, take these 3 gentlemen and break every finger on their dominant hands. If I ever see them collecting debts in my city again, you will break their spines. Do we understand each other?" The thugs violently nodded their heads, absolutely terrified, practically volunteering their hands to Sullivan just to avoid Declan's direct wrath. Declan finally turned his attention to the pile of trash where Ricky was violently coughing. He walked over, the heavy sole of his shoes crunching against broken glass. He crouched down, grabbing Ricky by his greasy hair, forcing the man to look at him. "You are going to listen to me very carefully, Richard," Declan murmured, his voice deadly smooth. "William Jenkins' debt is hereby cannelled, erased. If you or anyone connected to you ever speaks the name Jenkins again, if you ever look in the general direct of this woman or her little sister, I will not kill you quickly. I will lock you in the basement of my meat-packing plant, and I will keep you alive for a very, very long time. Nod if you comprehend the mathematics of this situation." Ricky, weeping openly, nodded frantically, tears mixing with the filth on his face. "Yes, yes, God. Yes, Mr. Gallagher. I swear they don't exist to me. I swear on my mother's life." "Good," Declan said, releasing the man's hair and standing up. "Leave Chicago by sunrise or I'll kill you anyway." Declan turned away from the human garbage and walked toward Clara. She instinctively flinched, curling tighter into a ball, expecting the violence to inevitably turn toward her. Men like this didn't do favors for free. They always collected a toll. But as Declan knelt beside her, his demeanor shifted completely. The terrifying apex predator vanished, replaced by a strange, almost solemn gentleness. He stripped off his suit jacket, his second ruined thousand jacket of the evening, and draped it carefully over Clara's shivering, soaked body. The fabric was warm, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and tobacco. "It's over, Miss Jenkins," Declan said quietly. "You are safe." "Lie," Clara whispered, her voice barely a dry croak, her eyelids drooping heavily. The adrenaline was leaving her system, and the crushing agony of her bruised ribs and head wound was rapidly taking over. "She is safe. She is eating ice cream in a very secure building." Declan reassured her, effortlessly sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. With astonishing ease, he lifted Clara from the cold pavement. She felt incredibly light to him, frail and starved, entirely too fragile to have been fighting off grown men. As Declan carried her towards the waiting Escalade, Clara's head lolled against his chest. Her vision was completely fading to black, the edges of her consciousness fraying. Just before she passed out, a heavy silver locket that had been hidden beneath her torn blouse slipped out, dangling freely from her neck. It caught the harsh glare of the SUV's headlights. Declan's sharp eyes caught the flash of silver. He paused mid-stride, his gaze locking onto the intricate, deeply unique engraving on the face of the locket. It was a crest, a roaring lion holding a broken broadsword. It wasn't a cheap piece of pawn-shop jewelry. It was a custom insignia, a very specific, highly guarded insignia belonging to the old Irish mob syndicates from the East Coast. Specifically, it was the crest of a man who had vanished 15 years ago. A man who had taken a bullet meant for Declan's own father during a brutal ambush in Boston. Declan's breath hitched, a rare moment of genuine shock, cracking his iron composure. He stared at Clara's bruised, unconscious face, recognizing the faint, undeniable structural similarities around her jawline and eyes. "William Jenkins," Declan muttered to himself, the pieces clicking together with devastating clarity. William Jenkins hadn't just been a degenerate gambler who owed dirty money to a street thug. William Jenkins was actually William O'Connor, the ghost of the Boston Syndicate, the man who had traded his entire criminal empire and his true identity to go into hiding and protect his daughters. And Declan's family owed this dead man a life debt, a debt of honor that superseded all laws of the Mafia. "Sullivan," Declan barked, his voice suddenly thick with absolute urgency. Sullivan, who was busy systematically snapping the index finger of the first crying thug, jogged over quickly. "Yeah, boss. Call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to prep the underground surgical suite at the private estate immediately." We aren't taking her to a public hospital. Bring the little girl from the club to the mansion safely. No one, and I mean absolutely no one outside our inner circle, finds out these girls are with us." Sullivan raised an eyebrow, sensing the massive shift in his boss's demeanor. "Understood. Who are they, boss?" Declan looked down at Clara, securing her tightly against his chest as he stepped into the warm leather interior of the luxury SUV. The rain continued to hammer violently against the armored roof, but inside a new protective fortress was being built. "They," Declan said softly, his jaw set with unshakable resolve. "Our family." As the convoy of black SUVs sped away from the filthy alley, disappearing into the neon-lit rain-sick streets of Chicago, Clara remained blissfully unconscious, completely unaware that her life and the life of her little sister had just been permanently fused to the most dangerous man in the city. The debt of blood had been repaid, but the true war for their survival was only just beginning. Consciousness returned to Clara Jenkins, not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent, suffocating wave of pure panic. The scent of sterile iodine and medical-grade alcohol assaulted her senses, a stark and jarring contrast to the metallic stench of rain and blood from the alleyway. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, only to be blinded by the harsh, brilliant glare of overhead surgical lights. Instinct took over. Clara tried to thrash, to sit up and fight whoever had her, but a sudden blinding agony flared in her ribs, forcing a sharp cry from her bruised lips. "Do not attempt to sit up, Miss Jenkins. Your body has endured significant trauma." A calm, clinical voice instructed from the periphery of her vision. Clara blinked rapidly, her vision slowly adjusting to the pristine white environment. She wasn't in a dingy back alley clinic or a crowded, chaotic public emergency room. She was lying on a state-of-the-art surgical table in a room that looked like it belonged in a multi-million-dollar private hospital. An IV line was taped securely to the back of her left hand, feeding a steady drip of fluids and painkillers into her bloodstream. Beside her stood a man with graying temples, wearing a spotless white lab coat over a tailored dress shirt. A heavy, solid gold Rolex Submariner peeked out from beneath his cuff, a strange accessory for an ordinary doctor. Where is my sister?" Clara asked, her voice sounding like tearing sandpaper. She gripped the stainless steel edge of the operating table, her knuckles turning white. "Where is Lily?" "Your sister is perfectly safe, sleeping in a guest suite 3 floors above us," the doctor replied, checking the glowing monitors displaying Clara's vitals. "I am Dr. Harrison. You are currently in the private medical wing of the Gallagher estate. You suffered 3 cracked ribs, a minor concussion, a deep laceration above your left supraorbital ridge requiring 14 stitches, and severe contusions across your torso. If Mr. Bell Gallagher had arrived even 5 minutes later, you likely would have sustained fatal internal bleeding." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Gallagher. The fragmented, terrifying memories of the alleyway came rushing back in a tidal wave of adrenaline. The absolute monster in the tailored suit, the lone shark dangling in the air, gasping for his life, the heavily armed men standing in the pouring rain like a private paramilitary squad. She had been saved from a predator, only to be dragged directly into the lair of the devil himself. Before Clara could formulate another question, the heavy soundproofed steel door to the medical suite hissed open. Declan Gallagher stepped into the room. He had changed out of his ruined suit, now wearing a simple, impeccably fitted black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing glimpses of intricate dark ink tattooed across his muscular forearms. He carried a terrifying quiet gravity with him, pulling all the oxygen out of the room simply by existing within it. "Doctor." Harrison immediately stepped back, lowering his head in a gesture of absolute deference. "Her vitals are stabilizing, Declan. The internal swelling is going down. She's strong. Remarkably so. Leave us, Harrison, Declan commanded softly. The doctor didn't hesitate for a microcond. He gathered his tablet and swiftly exited the room, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him, sealing Clara inside with the most dangerous man in Chicago. Declan approached the side of the surgical table, his cold, steely grey eyes locked onto Clara's terrified face. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, observing a wounded bird. Clara instinctively trying to push herself backward, the monitors beside her beeping faster as her heart rate skyrocketed. "There is no need to be afraid of me, Clara," Declan said, his voice a low, growly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "If I intended to cause you harm, I would have left you to rot in that alley with Ricky Bull." "Why am I here?" Clara demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the violent trembling in her hands. "Men like you don't do favors for waitresses from the South Side. We don't have money. We don't have property. What do you want from us?" Declan's expression remained entirely unreadable. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a small, familiar object, the heavy silver locket. He held it up by its chain, the intricately engraved roaring lion, catching the harsh overhead light. Clara gasped, reaching up to her bare neck. "Give that back to me." "It belonged to my father. I am well aware of who this belonged to," Declan murmured, stepping closer and gently placing the cold silver locket into Clara's trembling palm. His fingers brushed against hers, surprisingly warm and calloused. "What I am attempting to deduce, Clara, is how much you actually know about the man who gave this to you." Clara frowned, clutching the locket to her chest, wincing as the movement aggravated her stitched ribs. "My father was William Jenkins. He was a mechanic. He fixed transmission systems for 20 years before the gambling addiction and the alcohol finally, carefully, destroyed him. He owed terrible people a lot of money, and when his liver failed, those monsters decided Lily and I were going to pay his debts." Declan stared at her, analyzing her dilated pupils, the raw honesty in her exhausted voice. She was telling the truth. She had absolutely no idea. She believed her father was nothing more than a broken, destitute mechanic who had left his daughters drowning in a sea of loan shark debt. "Your father lied to you, Clara," Declan stated plainly, offering no padding for the harsh reality. His name was not William Jenkins, it was William O'Connor. And 15 years ago, before he fled the East Coast and buried himself in the grease of a Chicago mechanic shop, he was the undisputed head of the largest Irish syndicate in Boston. Clara stared at him, her mind completely short-circuiting. She let out a dry, humorless laugh that immediately turned into a painful cough. "You're insane. My father could barely afford the rent on our 2-bedroom apartment. If he was a mafia boss, where was the money? Where were the mansions?" "He traded the empire to keep you breathing," Declan explained, pulling up a stainless steel rolling stool and sitting beside her. For the first time, Clara saw a flicker of profound exhaustion in the Mafia boss's eyes. 15 years ago, my father, Arthur Gallagher, attended a sit-down in Boston to negotiate a truce between the coastal families. It was a trap. A rival faction ambushed the meeting with automatic weapons. Your father threw himself in front of my father, taking a bullet to the chest that was meant to tear my father's head off. Clara stopped breathing, the sterile room suddenly spinning around her. William survived, but the ambush triggered a massive bloody war across the eastern seaboard. Declan continued, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. Knowing his enemies would target his wife and his infant daughter, you, Clara, he faked his own death. He vanished into the wind. My father spent a decade trying to find him to repay the blood debt. But William was a ghost, until tonight, when a 7-year-old girl wearing a yellow raincoat burst into my private club. begging for someone to save her sister. Declan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive frame dwarfing the stool. Your father saved my family's legacy. In our world, a debt of blood is the only currency that matters. You and Lily are under my protection now. The Galaga Syndicate will burn Chicago to the ash before anyone touches a single hair on your heads again. Clara closed her eyes, hot tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracking through the iodine wiped on her cheeks. Her entire life, the poverty, the struggle, the abuse, it had all been a carefully constructed lie to hide them from monsters far worse than Ricky Bull. And now the veil was violently ripped away. I want to see Lily Clara Arara whispered, her voice breaker. Dang. Please, I just need to hold my sister. Declan's jaw tightened. He stood up, towering over the surgical bed. I will have Sullivan bring a wheelchair. Welcome to the family, Clara Arara. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan in a smear of bruised purple and slate-gray clouds. The storm had finally passed, but inside the fortified walls of the Gallagher estate, a much more dangerous tempest was brewing. The estate was a sprawling 20-acre fortress located in the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of the North Shore, surrounded by 2 iron gates, motion sensors, and heavily armed perimeter guards carrying suppressed heckler and cokeps. It was impenetrable to law enforcement and rival gangs alike. Inside the main house, specifically in the subterranean mahogany boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Declan sat at the head of a massive polished obsidian conference table. Spread out before him were the financial ledgers for the shipping ports, but his mind was completely focused on the bloodbath that was inevitably coming. Gathered around the table were his 5 capos, the ruthless lieutenants who managed the gambling, narcotics, extortion, and smuggling rings that funded the Gallagher empire. Dominic, a grizzled, silver-haired capo who had served under Declan's father, slammed his thick fist onto the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. With all due respect, Declan, this is madness, Dominic snarled, his face flushed with anger. You walked away from the Romano negotiation, $3 million a month in shipping revenue gone, because you decided to play knight in shining armor for 2 street strays. The Romanos are already spreading rumors that the Gallagher family has gone soft, that you're losing your edge over a pretty face. Sullivan, standing in his usual spot over Declan's right shoulder, casually rested his hand on the customized Colt M1. 911 hosted at his hip. Tworn, Dom. You're speaking to the boss. Declan didn't raise his voice. He simply steepled his fingers, locking his cold gaze onto Dominic until the older man shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The girls are William O'Connor's daughters, Declan stated, the words dropping into the room like a live grenade. The reaction was instantaneous. The murmurs and grumbling ceased entirely. 3 of the capos visibly palled. Even Dominic's aggressive posture deflated, his eyes widening in absolute shock. In the underworld, the name O'Connor was a legend. A ghost story used to terrify young enforcers. O'Connor is dead, Dominic stammered, shaking his head. He was wiped out 15 years ago in the Boston massacre. He survived, went into hiding, and died of liver failure 6 months ago, here in Chicago, under an assumed name. Declan, corrected, his tone leaving zero room for debate. His daughters were left exposed. A bottom-feeding loan shark named Ricky Bow laid hands on the eldest last night. I handled it. Jesus Christ, murmured Luca, the capo in charge of the city's underground casinos. If word gets out that O'Connor's bloodline is alive and residing in Chicago, Declan, the East Coast factions will lose their minds. Silas Fitzpatrick took over O'Connor's territory after he vanished. If Silas finds out the rightful heirs to the Boston throne are breathing, he will send an army of hitters to wipe them off the map to secure his claim. Let Silas Fitzpatrick come, Declan said, his voice dropping an octave, practically vibrating with suppressed violence. "Let him send every trigger puller he has. I will bury them all under the foundation of my new casinos. The Gallagher family owes a blood debt to William O'Connor. We do not abandon our debts, and we do not cower from ghosts." Declan stood up abruptly, signaling the end of the council. "Double death. Perimeter guards around the estate. Move our assets away from the Romano borders. If they want a turf war, give it to them. And absolutely no one outside this room breathes a word about the girls. If the East Coast hears a whisper, I will personally pull the tongues out of every man at this table." Dismissed. As the couple scrambled to leave the room, terrified of Declan's wrath, Sullivan lingered behind. He poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25 into a crystal tumbler and slid it across the obsidian table to his boss. "You're playing a dangerous game, Declan," Sullivan noted quietly, lacking the usual jovial cruelty he displayed on the streets. "You're putting the entire syndicate at risk for a girl you met 12 hours ago." "I am honoring my father," Declan replied, taking a slow sip of the scotch, the burn grounding him. "Right," Sullivan smirked slightly, crossing his massive arms, "and it has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you haven't taken your eyes off the security monitors showing the guest suite since you woke up." Declan's gaze snapped to Sullivan, a silent warning flashing in his grey eyes. But before he could reprimand his enforcer, the encrypted satellite phone resting on the table began to vibrate wildly. Declan picked it up, pressing it to his ear. "Speak." The voice on the other end was distorted, heavily masked by encryption software. But the panic in the informant's tone was unmistakable. "Boss, it's Mickey from the airport detail. We got a massive problem. 2 private Gulfstream jets just touched down at O'Hare, unlogged. Cash payments to the air traffic controllers. They bypassed customs entirely." Declan's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing creaked. "Who was on the planes, Mickey?" 20 heavily armed men, boss, wearing tactical gear under long coats, and they were led by a guy missing half his left ear. "It's him, Declan. Silas Fitzpatrick is in Chicago." Declan disconnected the call, gently placing the phone back onto the obsidian table. The silence in the subterranean room was deafening. The war hadn't just been declared, it had already arrived at their front door. "Sullivan," Declan said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, the terrifying mask of the apex predator slipping fully back into place. "Unlock the heavy armory and tell Dr. Harrison to move Clara and Lily to the panic room beneath the library. The Boston dogs are off their leashes." As Sullivan sprinted out of the room to sound the alarm, Declan looked up at the digital clock on the wall. It had been less than 24 hours since a little girl in a yellow raincoat had shattered his world, and now the streets of Chicago were about to run, red with blood. Gunfire shattered the serene, rain-washed silence of the North Shore suburbs before the Gallagher estates' heavy wrought iron gates could even fully lock down. Silas Fitzpatrick, a man who had built his East Coast empire on a foundation of absolute brutality, did not believe in diplomatic sit-downs. He believed in shock and awe. 4 heavily armored matte black Chevrolet Suburbans smashed through the outer perimeter fencing of the 20-acre property, their reinforced steel bumpers tearing through the landscaping and triggering a cacophony of blaring security sirens. Deep beneath the sprawling mansion, inside a reinforced climate-controlled panic room, disguised behind the antique bookshelves of the main library, Clara Jenkins held her little sister tightly against her chest. Lily, completely oblivious to the scale of the cartel war exploding above them, was fast asleep, clutching a brand-new plush rabbit that Dr. Harrison had given her. Clara, however, was wide awake, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. She stared at the bank of high-definition security monitors mounted on the concrete wall, watching in sheer horror as the tactical assault unfolded. Upstairs, the Gallagher syndicate moved with terrifying, well-oiled precision. Declan Gallagher did not cower in the basement with the VIPs. He stood in the grand foyer, his black dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, calmly loading a customized drum fired at 12, automatic shotgun. The massive crystal chandelier above him cast fractured light across his hard, expressionless face. Sullivan stood to his left, racking the slide of a heavy assault rifle, while 24 of Declan's most elite enforcers took up defensive positions behind the marble pillars and overturned mahogany antique tables. "Let them funnel through the main doors," Declan ordered, his voice cold and steady, cutting through the chaos of the sirens. "Do not engage until they cross the threshold. I want them trapped in the kill zone." Outside, Silas's mercenaries poured out of the Suburbans, wearing heavy Kevlar vests and night vision goggles. They moved aggressively up the sprawling cobblestone driveway, laying down a suppressing field of automatic fire that shattered the mansion's priceless stained glass windows and ripped through the imported Italian brickwork. Suddenly, the massive oak front doors were kicked open. A flashbang grenade bounced across the polished marble floor. "Eyes down," Sullivan roared. The grenade detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening crack, but Declan's men were already shielded. The second the blinding light faded, 5 of Silas's heavily armed hitters rushed into the foyer. Declan didn't even flinch. He raised the AA-12 and squeezed the trigger. The sheer destructive power of the automatic shotgun was devastating. The deafening roar of the weapon echoed through the mansion as the heavy slugs tore through the intruder's body armor, like paper, throwing them violently backward onto the cobblestones. Sullivan and the rest of the Gallagher enforcers opened fire simultaneously, creating an impenetrable wall of lead that instantly stalled the Boston Syndicate's advance. Blood rapidly pooled on the pristine marble floors, ruining priceless Persian rugs. The smell of sulfur, cordite, and copper filled the air. Clara watched the monitors in the panic room, her breath catching in her throat. She saw Declan moving through the chaotic crossfire with the terrifying grace of a mythical god of war. He wasn't just defending his territory, he was actively hunting. Every time he pulled the trigger, an enemy fell. He was an apex predator protecting what he had claimed. And to her absolute shock, Clara realized she felt an overwhelming sense of safety, knowing this monster was fighting for her. Outside, Silas Fitzpatrick, recognizable by the jagged scar tissue where his left ear used to be, realized his frontal assault was failing. Declan's men were too entrenched, too disciplined. Frustrated and bleeding from a grazing graze to his shoulder, Silas ordered his remaining men to fall back towards the tree to regroup, but Declan had anticipated the retreat. Dominic. Declan barked into his tactical earpiece. Pincer movement now. From the shadows of the estate's dense, manicured forest, Dominic and a second squad of Gallagher enforcers emerged, entirely cutting off Silas's escape route. The Boston boss was instantly trapped between the fortified mansion and a heavily armed flanking unit. Declan slowly walked out of the ruined front doors, his boots crunching on shattered glass and brass casings. The rain had started to fall again, washing the blood down the steps. He tossed the empty shotgun aside and drew the sleek custom N1 911 pistol from his holster. Silas, breathing heavily, dropped his empty rifle and raised his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen men. "Dan, you're making a massive mistake, Gallagher," Silas spat, his thick Boston accent laced with venom. "You think you can hide William's brat? The entire East Coast will come for you. You can't fight a 5-family war over a piece of trash." Wait, a single deafening gunshot cut through the rain. Silas's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream as he collapsed to his knees, clutching a catastrophic wound in his abdomen. Declan, casually lowered his pistol, walking down the steps until he stood over the dying East Coast kingpin. "She is not trash," Declan whispered coldly, his grey eyes devoid of any mercy. "She is the rightful queen of Boston, and you are trespassing on my lawn." Declan raised the pistol one last time and pulled the trigger, officially ending the Fitzpatrick reign and cementing the Gallagher Syndicate's absolute dominance. Silence, heavy and metallic, finally reclaimed the Gallagher estate. The flashing red lights of the security system cast eerie shadows across the ruined grand foyer. Declan stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving slightly, a shallow, bleeding cut grazing his left cheekbone. He systematically checked his men, ordering Dr. Harrison's medical team to tend to the wounded and dispatching a cleanup crew to dispose of the Boston Syndicate's remnants before local law enforcement even considered investigating the wealthy, highly bribed neighborhood. Down in the panic room, the heavy steel door hissed, unlocking from the outside. Clara tensed, pulling a sleeping Lily closer, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Declan stepped into the small concrete room. He looked exhausted, his black shirt stained with gunpowder and dirt, but his posture remained impeccably straight. He looked at Clara, his hard expression softening just a fraction. "It's over," Declan said quietly. "Silas is dead. His lieutenants are I. They're dead or currently negotiating their surrender to my capos. You're safe, Clara." Clara didn't rush forward to thank him. Instead, she carefully laid Lily down on the small cot, covering her with a heavy blanket. She stood up, wincing as her bruised ribs protested, and walked slowly towards the MafiaBoss. She looked at the blood on his cheek, at the dark, violent reality of his world, a world she was now irrevocably tied to by blood and circumstance. "You killed him," Clara stated, her voice remarkably steady. "I eliminated a threat to my family," Declan corrected softly. "And to you," Clara reached into the pocket of the oversized sweater Dr. Harrison had given her. She pulled out a small, worn leather journal. "When my father died, the landlord gave me a box of his personal belongings, mostly junk, broken watches, old receipts. I found this at the bottom. I thought it was just the rambling math of a drunken gambler. Strings of random numbers and bank routing codes. But after what you told me earlier," Declan's eyes narrowed as he took the journal from her hands. He flipped it open, his sharp mind immediately recognizing the complex encryption cipher used by the old-school Irish syndicates. His breath hitched. "Clara," Declan murmured, looking up at her in absolute shock. "This isn't a ledger of debts. These are offshore Cayman Island accounts, Swiss safe deposit boxes, shell corporations in Dublin. This is the entire hidden treasury of the O'Connor Empire. Your father didn't lose his fortune. He buried it, and he left you the map." Clara stood taller, the fear that had dictated her entire life finally burning away, replaced by the hardening steel of her true lineage. "Bricky Bowl beat me over a $50,000 phantom debt while I had hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in my pocket. I was a victim because I didn't know who I was." She took a step closer to Declan, closing the distance between them. The air crackled with a new intense energy. It wasn't just the raw magnetic pull of their shared trauma. It was the intoxicating gravity of two apex predators recognizing each other. "You saved my sister, Declan. You bled for me," Clara said, her voice dropping to a fierce, commanding whisper. "The Gallagher family honored their debt. Now I am going to honor mine. I am not going to hide in your panic rooms. I am going to claim my father's empire, and I am going to merge it with yours." Declan stared down at the beautiful, fiercely intelligent woman standing before him. The bruised, terrified waitress from the alleyway was completely gone, replaced by a terrifyingly calm queen, ready to go to war. A slow, dangerous smile curved Declan's lips, the first genuine smile he had worn in years. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the unbruised side of her jawline. the East Coast families will bow to you, Clara, or I will slaughter every last one of them who refuses. We rule this underworld together." "Together," Clara agreed, her hand resting against his chest, directly over his beating heart. The little girl in the yellow raincoat had run to the Mafia boss for mercy. What she found was a monster willing to burn the entire world down just to protect her. And what Clara found was the crown she was always meant to wear. The streets of Chicago had washed away the past, and from the ashes of the old syndicates, a new and unstoppable empire was born. What started as a desperate plea from a terrified 7-year-old girl in a soaked yellow raincoat evolved into the most legendary shift of power in the modern underworld. Clara Jenkins stepped out of the shadows of poverty and abuse to reclaim her rightful throne as Clara O'Connor, standing side by side with the untouchable Declan Gallagher. Their story proves that sometimes the monsters we are taught to fear are the only ones truly capable of saving us from the real demons of this world. Blood debts were paid, empires were shattered, and an unbreakable dynasty was forged in the fires of Chicago. If this story of Clara and Declan moved you, from a gritty back-alley rescue all the way to absolute mafia royalty, then hit that like button right now. Share this with your fellow romance and drama lovers. Subscribe to our channel Table Number 6 for more thrilling, dark, and twist-filled stories, and drop your country name in the comments below. We want to know exactly where in this world our family is watching from.